Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. It's hosted by the Midwest Perennial Forage Working Group of Grassland 2.0, or Grassland 2.0, sorry about that. Green Lands, Blue Waters. I'm Laura Payne, and my day job is working for Grassland 2.0, but I'm also a co-chair of the Midwest Perennial Forage Working Group. Our goals are to collaboratively work across the states to organize projects like the Midwest Grazing Exchange. We thought this was a very timely topic with the very weird and variable weather we've had across the region. People looking for forage and people having excess forage. So I'll just let Megan Filbert from Practical Farmers of Iowa take it away and tell us about the Grazing Exchange.
Thanks, Laura. Welcome all. I am going to introduce the concept of the Midwest Grazing Exchange and raise awareness around this tool that we hope many of you can use if you're not already using it. So really what the Midwest Grazing Exchange is, it's a website that is a free matchmaking service that aims to connect livestock farmers with landowners across 6 states in the Midwestern region. So those states are Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. And essentially graziers can search for forage to graze, which is timely in times of drought. And landowners can search for livestock to graze their land. So a little bit of background about this website and how to use it. The Midwest Grazing Exchange was launched in October of 2020. So it's not quite a year old, and we're always open for suggestions to make improvements on the site if you're using it and find something. It's certainly not a static document. We will continue improving it. And this website was co-developed by Practical Farmers of Iowa and the Pasture project out of the Wallace Winrock Center as part of what Laura said, the Midwest Perennial Forage Working Group, which is a group of grazing educators in the upper Midwest. So this is a screenshot of the landing page. When you visit midwestgrazingexchange.com, this is what you will see first. And essentially what this website lets users do. You can search listings, which that search function includes an interactive map with filters for criteria like seasons you're looking for grazing or for grazers, land type, and or livestock species. You can then create your own listing of what land or livestock you have to offer up. As I've said, this is a free service. So you create a free account, and from that account, you're able to save listings of interest to revisit later. You can add multiple listings of what you have to offer. And when you create a free account, that's when you're able to see the contact details of other users and message them through the site and or get their phone number or email, which is an optional function if you want to add that to your profile. So the other thing on this website is there's a resources tab, which allows you to browse a curated list of different grazing resources, which includes examples of grazing lease agreements and contracts, which is a very important element of the relationships side of this matchmaking service. And the site also allows you to explore and read up on the benefits of regenerative grazing for both landowners and for livestock owners. So I wanted to present a snapshot of the current listings on our site right now. So this is what the map looks like. It is interactive. You can toggle over different pins and their profile will pop up. But essentially what I wanted to show is that the orange pins represent the livestock listings. The green pins represent the land listings. And you will be able to choose specifics, whether you're listing livestock or land. So for this example that I've screenshotted on the right here, I've chosen land, and it comes up with some other filters, such as the seasons that you would like grazing to take place. You can list one or all of them, and then the land type you have to offer. So we tried to be inclusive of the different types of land types within our Midwestern region. So that would be pasture, native prairie, and that would CRP would fall under native prairie most likely. Crop residue, corn and soybean residue, cover crops, woodland oak savanna, so silvopasture practices, urban grazing. We get a lot of requests around using goats for vegetative management in urban settings. And then you could click on other and describe it later on when you're creating your listing. So I do want to point out that the Midwest Grazing Exchange is not the only exchange of this type. This is the current list of the other exchanges that exist around the nation. And in the process of developing our website, we first reached out to the folks at the South Dakota Grazing Exchange to learn more about their website, which was developed prior to ours. Now, I do want to point out that most of these exchanges are state-based. And something that is unique around the Midwest Grazing Exchange is that it serves multiple states within our region. And we felt this was an important feature because many of the livestock producers we work with, we know they transport their animals over state lines, especially if they're farmers that live near the borders of a state. And we wanted to continue to foster that connection. And we also think that multi-state connection or regional connection is especially useful in times of drought, when you're looking maybe a little further for forage than you normally would. So I want to point out that we recently created a Facebook group that is essentially a space to house the National Grazing Exchange directory. So that list of all of the exchanges that currently exists is under the services tab in this Facebook group. So please, if you have Facebook, follow this, join this group. There'll be posts made and access. Then this is how you can gain access and be knowledgeable of the different grazing exchanges that do exist around the nation. We also have been in discussion with other regions and grazing educators in other regions, and we know that there will be more exchanges coming online in the future. So this is just a space for us to curate all of those resources. So at this point, I would love to have Cindy Zink unmute herself and talk a little bit about the South Dakota Grazing Exchange. She's the creator and the administrator of this exchange. So Cindy, I'll hand it over to you for a few minutes.
Thank you, Megan. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the South Dakota Grazing Exchange. It was developed in 2019. It came on board. And although it is called the South Dakota Grazing Exchange, it is able, as you can see, there are pins right there in Minnesota. And if you zoom out and go on to the Grazing Exchange, it is all encompassing of the United States. So just like Megan had highlighted how the importance of utilizing our neighboring states and those resources available, agriculture really does have a unique ability for helping each other, and this Grazing Exchange really does provide that basis. So livestock owners and land-based owners are able to connect. It is on that same basis, and with the Grazing Exchange, we are able to connect anywhere in the United States. So we really want, it is very similar to the Midwest Grazing Exchange, and Megan did an excellent job of pointing out the highlights with the different land bases and being able to sort or search by them. I do think those are keys for individuals. Another aspect is making sure that producers are able to have that comfort level and knowing where their livestock is being housed or being cared for, and making sure those adequate resources are available. So it is a connecting point, and we appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Cindy. Yes, something I like to say to groups of farmers is that it's kind of like a dating site for cows. So it's like Tinder for cows, and that usually sticks with people's memories pretty well, but it really functions very similarly. I also want to draw your attention to specifically for the folks in Minnesota. So there is another grazing exchange that's state-based in Minnesota called the Cropland Grazing Exchange. It's administered by Kelly Anderson through the Department of Agriculture. Kelly's not on this call today, but I just wanted to point out that there is another resource for folks in Minnesota to explore extra forage options. So to get to the heart of why we're speaking today and why we organize this webinar is because we're in extreme drought in several states. And so how we see this resource being applied during this drought could be to urge conservation land managers, landowners, and or farmers to list forage that they may have available. So we think that would look like CRP land that has been opened up for emergency haying or grazing. It could look like other private lands or woodlands that are owned by private landowners, or it could look like working with public land managers, so the DNR or other organizations, and opening up some of that conservation land or public land or hunting land for grazing. So I did want to add the Crp update map here for Iowa. That was just announced 3 days ago. So the darker orange counties, I believe there's 11 to 15 counties in Iowa that now have been approved as of 3 days ago for emergency haying and grazing. I also think that a function of the exchange right now would be to urge landowners to sign up, drop a pin for their land that could potentially use to cut for hay. So again, maybe this applies most to CRP land that hay could be made from. So anyone that may be able to be in touch with landowners that they know have CRP that is just standing grass right now, I would urge them to utilize this resource. And we want the audience today to promote this exchange to landowners or people that may have extra forage in non-drought areas. So I am tailoring this to the folks that I know that own farms in Southeast Iowa, folks in Missouri that are having less of a drought issue, and then in Illinois and Indiana. Obviously, there's going to be lots of considerations to make on whether you can actually should transport animals to those places, or if you could transport hay from those places, but at least this is a starting point to make that connection and have those discussions with folks that have more forage available. And at this time, I'd really like to take a few minutes for folks to make any comments or questions in the chat about any ideas they might have, how we can best utilize the Midwest Grazing Exchange during drought. So any of my fellow grazing educators or those listening, please chime in with any ideas of how this could be best applied.
While folks are typing that, I'll just jump in with a little bit of housekeeping. This is Jane Jewett, and I see that Teresa Kevaney on the attendee list raised her hand. If others want to raise their hand, I can unmute you to speak. Otherwise, if you're comfortable typing in the chat and Q&A, that would be great as well. We do have people on who are monitoring those to make sure questions get asked from the chat and the Q&A box. So Teresa, I'm going to unmute you now.
Great, thank you. Perhaps this has already been done. I'm assuming it has, but have we promoted this with the state cattlemen, the sheep producers in Minnesota? And could we work with them to get this exchange out to their respective members?
I think.
Go ahead, Jared.
I was just going to say, I believe we have in the past. We had them send it out through their newsletter. It could be something we promote again. And in addition to just Minnesota, if we have a bunch of people in Minnesota, it'll end up just be a bunch of people posting looking for land with a bunch of cattle, because there's a lot of cows and not a lot of grass. But you're right on about maybe even talking with some of the national organizations to where in the country are there excesses of grass, maybe having them promote it, the NCBA or other organizations at the national level those could be some good orgs.
Or even like the Minnesota lamb and wool growers. I really don't know what the best thing to do would be to get more people with available grass or pasture, besides just pushing it out to conventional farm groups in addition to our own. But maybe sort of a special all-call drought urgency. Hey, there's this Cropland Grazing Exchange, and we need grassland. If you have some available, here's the dating service, so to speak.
Thanks for those thoughts, Teresa.
Sure.
So lastly, what I would love to do with this group is to walk through an example of what it takes to create a listing. It's very straightforward, and really we'll breeze through this pretty quickly. But essentially, on the landing page, when you visit the website, you'll scroll down and you'll see a spot to create your own listing, and you'll click on the button there, and this will allow you to start creating that free account. So what it'll ask for first is for you to enter a name, your phone number, which is optional, an about me section that you can fill out to your liking, and a photo, which is also optional. Then you will be walked through 5 steps to create your actual listing. Remember that you can create, if you're not ready to create a listing, you could still create a profile and be able to save listings that you're interested in. And you can also explore what the listings that are out there without even creating a profile. So there are several different options of engagement there. So step 1, I am walking through this example as I'm listing land, and you're able to title your listing. So that's the first thing that users are going to see. So I titled this CRP land for haying or grazing. My land type is native pasture. And in step 2, I have identified that I have 45 acres available and that I'm willing for livestock to graze that land in the summer and the fall. You can also then select any sort of options that apply. So I've selected that this 45 acres is privately owned and that there is water available on site. There are other things that you can select here, such as if it's a publicly owned site, if there's electricity available, and it'd be important to select if there is existing fence if you have it. Now, steps 3 and 4. So this is where you would actually enter your specific address, but it's important to note that your exact address will never show up publicly, and the pin that drops on the map is only approximate. So no one can get on the site and actually find where you live. They have to engage with you through the messaging service or through texting or calling to actually get your address. And then I've also selected here at the bottom, notify me when new livestock listings are created within 50 miles of this land listing. So that's an optional function, but this will automate email messages to me when someone drops a pin with livestock that are within 50 miles. Then step 4 is to provide a description of your land. So this is where you would describe certain features. Maybe it's really hilly and there's a steep slope. Maybe there's a seep and it's very wet in one corner. So these are the types of things you would want the grazing partner or the landowner to be aware of. And maybe it's as a landowner, maybe it's the grazing management style that you're looking for. So you would prefer if someone practices rotational grazing versus continuous set stock grazing. And then of course, provide any sort of details here on the livestock care that may be available. Are you willing to check on the cattle and the fences or not? So those are all just certain details that are going to help you build this relationship and create a contract. And then the last step here is to upload photos of your land or your livestock. And then there's an option here to upload any sort of additional documents. So those could be things like a map. They could be a forage analysis that you've had taken recently, or any sort of herd health documents for your herd. And when you're finished with this, you're going to click add listing, and that's going to be populated on the map and available for others to see. So just a couple more things to touch on before I turn it over to my colleagues. So some really important reminders. We promote the use of more formal contracts. So we're talking about something a little bit more than a handshake, because that can help form positive working relationships. Or if something were to go south, you can rely on that contract. Also, obviously, you all know this, but clear communication is key in successful matchmaking. And so I want to always reiterate that point. And lastly, we have a ton of different promotional materials around the Midwest Grazing Exchange that we are happy to share. So if you are interested in sending this out to your networks to get more folks to post during this time of drought, please let me know if you would like a flyer such as the one here displayed on the left. We have pre-written social media blurbs. We have a press release. We have lots of photos, and we have different logo files that you are welcome to use in promotion. So please just email me or call me. There's my contact information on the screen. And let me know if you would like me to send you our promotional kit. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Laura.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan. That was a great presentation. Any other quick questions, or we have a good time here? We got a couple more minutes. Does anyone have a question or two to ask? I'll just add that I put into the chat a link to the Midwest Perennial Forage website that has a series of fact sheets on contract grazing and what goes into those contracts and things. So that's another resource that you can use. You have any questions coming in? Okay. Well, we'll have time at the end for questions as well. So why don't we keep moving? Our next presenters are going to be talking about what goes into those contracts and leases, and we'll be talking about their own experience with working with another landowner or another forage producer or another livestock producer in one of these contracted situations. So I think I'll call on Jared to start us off. If you can just introduce yourself and talk about your experience with the Grazing Exchange and contract grazing.
Yeah, so, and Doug's also on, and we're kind of going to go back and forth, but I'll introduce myself at least first. So I'm the Soil Health Lead for the Sustainable Farming Association, but I also farm here in Goody, Minnesota with my dad, and we've done contract grazing in a couple of different ways. The way we've been doing it for about 3 years now is we've actually sent our cows away to graze crop residue in winter. We've done that for a few reasons. The primary incentive for us was cost savings, and that we're able to reduce our costs on winter feed costs significantly. We did the math on what it cost us to make hay, and it was pushing up close on $3 per day to feed hay. About $156 a ton was what it cost us, and we can graze corn stalks locally if we put in the labor and the fence and the water for as cheap as 50 cents per day. And so that was really a great way for us to reduce our costs. We're fortunate that we did that to kind of get trials out of the way and to create relationships, because now going into this winter when there's obviously a shortage of feed, we're feeling much more comfortable knowing that we have still a source of feed for the winter. I guess it's a blessing and a little bit of a frustration when we look around, and at least in our area, all the corn and soybeans look perfect. And meanwhile, our grass is drying up and our hay is struggling. So it's a good thing. But having a little bit of a relationship with some crop farmers and depending on that as part of our winter forage plan has given us some resiliency this year in particular. And I can let Doug hop on and talk about his. Well, I should say also, we this year for the first time experimented with bringing in a group of dairy heifers and custom grazing dairy heifers in the summer months on grass, which this year wasn't the best year to bring in extra animals and try something new, obviously, but we gave it a shot and they actually left this morning a little earlier than planned, but we're fortunate to have that flexibility. And we'll talk about some of the things that we look at having a conversation with about the person we're working with in that contract in a little bit, but I'll let Doug introduce himself and kind of what he's been doing.
Yeah, I'm Doug Voss. We farm by Painesville, and we've been participating for quite a while in what I refer to as custom grazing. We've been taking on dairy replacement heifers, primarily organic dairy replacement heifers on our farm for a number of years, where we've provided grass and full care for the summer months. And just recently, we've started now grazing public lands with cow-calf pairs this year on another venture. And ironically enough, that was stemmed in part due to drought relief, which ended up kind of following the cattle from where they came from to our neck of the woods. And so it's been sobering to experience that, but it's also given us a good education on really addressing the issue of contracts. And so we've got some new insight that we didn't necessarily have before. I think there's tremendous value. The reason we started custom grazing initially was to, from an ecological standpoint, we wanted to improve the farm as quickly as possible. And the only way we saw that was possible is by getting more livestock on the farm. And we did not want to leverage ourselves by investing in livestock at that point to get to the numbers sufficient for that process. So that's how it kind of got us to where we are going now. And in the process, it's been a great learning experience to see the transformation the land can have when integrating livestock under a pretty strict management perspective. And so, yes, I think the timing of this webinar is tremendous. There's need out there, and I think we can do a lot better job of getting livestock to where it needs to be appropriately at the right time. And look forward to the conversation here as we go.
Yeah. And so I guess, I don't know if you had a specific question, Laura, or we can talk about what the
sounded like
contracts
you
look
had a
like as far as if you're able to. Oh yeah. If you guys are able through the Midwest Grazing Exchange or any other networks that you have, find somebody with grass. First of all, send them my way if they have extra. But secondly, there's some conversations you're going to want to have, some things you're going to want to think about when you set up those relationships. And to everybody, it's going to be up to you whether or not you have a contract. It's probably a great thing. I'll just full disclosure, be honest, like all of our relationships are close relationships and have been kind of handshake agreements. And so we don't have a written contract, but it's probably important to have one, especially if you start making connections outside of your region that you're not familiar with and that you haven't worked with. And there's a few things that you'd want to consider when you're putting those agreements together. And A few of the simple ones would be like who, and jump in, Doug, whenever there's something you want to add to, but a big one to start would be with like who's responsible for a few of the major things, like if an animal dies, are you liable? Are they liable? If there needs to be if there's transportation involved, who's responsible for the transportation? If they're breeding type animals and you need to breed these animals, who's responsible for the bulls and salt and mineral and different things, just is a basic responsibility that you would want to address with them. Doug, do you have anything to add on those?
Yeah, you struck a note with me with liability. So one of the things that we've learned is the liability always follows the livestock owner. And so even from a livestock insurance perspective, that's something you have to consider. And then, like you said, try to consider everything. Don't, I guess, don't belittle any aspect of this process, because there's always going to be tons of things that you didn't consider at the time that you wrote the contract. Such as a good example is, we prepared on one situation for if we had some incidental vet care that needed to happen, but what happens if it's just not an isolated case here or there? Who's responsible for a widespread vet care on a herd, and how specific is that with, if you're a care provider, how much are you willing to provide, and outline that in your contract? If conditions change, it was made reference before, but if you don't have grass, are you putting yourself in a position that you're required to come up with feed for these animals, whether it's stored feed or not, or are you going to have that clearly outlined in your contract? Because if you don't spell it out, or at least have a conversation about it, it's kind of anybody's game as to where that's going to go with things. So be very transparent, I think, and that always really is going to help your relationship with the two parties involved. And it really is a relationship thing. I mean, contracts are great, but even if you have to exercise your rights to a contract, you want to make sure that you try to deal with somebody that has just got good business sense and is reputable. So it is a relationship thing. And, even with putting posts on this, it's a lengthy process, and it could take much longer than anticipated initially. So we've got some sensitive timelines right now that we're working with making sure we can get feed when we need to for cattle. But I guess I just urge anybody that's listening or even watching the recording later, that if you have something that you're considering, put a post out there sooner than later, even if you don't have all the answers to questions that you have to kind of flesh out, but at least get the ball rolling. Because if there's somebody 20 miles down the road that could be a partner with you in this, and they don't know about you until they've already committed someplace else, we could probably cut down on some of the trucking or some of these other aspects. So think of everything, address everything, and plan the heck out of it all, because there's always something you're going to miss.
I was just going to add, in my previous role as a grazing broker for in southwestern Wisconsin, we always encouraged people to use a contract, and I've got an extension template that I use, and I like it because you can bring it up as a way of framing a conversation to create that relationship, and just kind of talk through who's going to furnish the salt and who's going to take care of stray animals and who's going to do the vet services. So a lot of people don't like written contracts, but I think if you think in terms of it as a relationship building tool, where we're just talking through all of these details that Doug and Jared have been alluding to. It's a good way to look at it.
A few of the other details when you're writing up those contracts, or at least discussing with the farmer, that to consider would be, payment is a big one. Obviously, as you as a livestock owner, if you need to pay, or as a grazer, how are you going to get paid? Are you being paid on a per pound of gain? Are you being paid on a per head per day basis? There's some unique contracts out there of people who do a certain percentage of the calf crop. If it's a cow calf operation that you're grazing, the grazer gets 60% of the calf crop, the livestock owner gets 40% or 30% or whatever that number is that you can negotiate. And then as far as the actual logistics of payments, it can be monthly, billed monthly, or maybe an estimate at the beginning of the contract, pay half down at the beginning and settle up at the end of the year. Those are some of the things. And then also something that would be important that we had an experience with this summer, bringing in some dairy heifers, is one animal in particular that just couldn't figure out electric polywire and having some sort of negotiate or having it in the contract or the discussion about, like, say one or a couple of animals are continually being trouble or things aren't working the way you need them to, how do you go about that? Can you send them back? Can you bring them to the sales barn? You know, what's that going to look like? Because these are things that can and will happen. And so just as I would say, one of the biggest advantages to being a custom grazer as having the grass is that you get to, you know, write up the contract in a way that gives you the flexibility and variability. You know, as a livestock owner, you don't have that. You own that animal and it's your responsibility to feed it, to care for it no matter what. And so write the contract in a way that it protects you and it gives you some flexibility in terms of, you know, some things that may happen that are out of your control or something you didn't consider. Yeah.
So would you guys want to, oh, go ahead.
I just saw a remark. There was a question I think that came through about biosecurity, and you know that's kind of it's a good thing to bring up for sure, because there are certain things that you have to consider not only from your own perspective. So, you know, from a vet perspective, there are certain limitations and requirements to cross state borders, and those have to be considered. But also, I just like to point out that, you know, as the person providing the service, in our case, the custom grazing, you know, we're responsible to ourselves to determine who qualifies to come on our farm or on our lands to graze. And that's not everybody. Like Jared said, if you've got one that just doesn't learn to stay in the fence, you know, we have to have something in place to take care of her in his situation, or in our case right now, we've got a bull like that as well. So yes, we have to make accommodations and arrangements for those types of things, but also, you know, certain vaccination requirements should also be considered. You know, if there is a known issue in the area of a certain ailment, that gets addressed before they get brought on to any of the custom grazed acres as well.
Yeah. One thing I would say too that might seem scary at first, both Doug and I now have experience in working with either livestock or landowners far away. Kind of to Megan's point of communication, our dairy heifers are both local, but we sent our cows last winter for the first time to Nebraska to graze corn stalks because it allowed us to feed instead of to the end of January to graze all the way till March 1st. And so, and Doug, I believe, brought his cows from another state as well. And so just kind of to Megan's point about communication, that's something else just to be extra vigilant on when you're working with people in other states, but it can be a very realistic and successful option. It's, yeah, again, it's something that's scary, and you know, to think about sending your cows or a long ways away, or to take in cattle from a long ways away, but I wouldn't overlook it, especially in times like this. We're grateful to have that connection now in Nebraska, where we can send them down as soon as their crops come off, and don't have to worry about feeding for an additional 4 months, which is again saving us money. But in this year, you know, it's saving us. I mean, it's cows that we otherwise would probably have had to sell. We're able to, you know, be in a lot better position. So look beyond what you might consider, especially like I mentioned earlier, in Minnesota alone, where I'm from anyway, most all of the state is impacted by drought somewhere. So for me to look around is probably going to be unlikely to find a lot of extra grass anywhere nearby me. We're all struggling with the same thing. But, and I haven't looked that closely, but I know there's some areas of the state that have had excess rain and moisture that may be in a different boat. So don't be afraid to look around. That was the benefit of the Midwest Grazing Exchange, why it was designed. Partly why it was designed is to get us looking beyond our state borders.
Yeah, and Jared, you know, one thing I'd add to that is just that, you know, everybody's got these things in their pocket. They've got such the ability to, you know, monitor things. So if you have livestock remotely, encourage, you know, the use of those cameras and those videos, and hey, be looking at those cattle, you know, maybe on a weekly basis, showing conditions, some representative photos of how the livestock are doing, because of course, anybody that entrusts their livestock with you to graze and that type of thing, you know, they want the confidence, they want to know where things are at, and that could be a good tool to help that communication.
So I was going to ask you, we don't have questions specifically about the lease piece yet, but one of the things that maybe you'd like to address is types of lease arrangements in terms of per head per day or per acre. What do you guys use for your animals, and how do they work for you?
I can jump in. I guess we do a daily rate on our place with a certain expectation of performance. but we're also not doing so much for stockers grazing. If we were doing stockers, we would most likely do a minimum basis as far as a daily rate, and then a premium over a certain daily gain, so that some of the risk could be reduced by the cattle owner, and yet the benefits of a good, successful grazing season can be shared by both that way. I think it's a good way to approach it. It sometimes mellows out some of the concern, and but it also can limit profit potential in certain situations. So it has to be one of those for sure, a good, some of those good situations that you arrive at with communications with two parties. But those are the two most common approaches that I am aware of.
Yeah, and we when we send our cows away and when we bring in heifers, it's a per head per day rate. That fee includes everything: labor, fence, water, and everything when we send our cows to Nebraska or when we bring in dairy heifers. As far as if you were summer grazing some sort of a stocker or thing, gain per pound of day, one thing I would just say is make sure you're charging a rate that values your time. I hear rates in my area all the time of people basing pasture rent on just kind of ground that they don't deem worth very much, and they don't value their time or their infrastructure or anything in it. So charge a rate that actually values your time properly. There are some unique ways, like I mentioned or alluded to earlier, of some sort of a lease share agreement that we've looked into with cows, is the 60-40 split on calf crop or 70-30 split on calf crop. That gives you as a landowner or as a grazer some sort of incentive. The more calves you have, the better calves you have. You're actually getting a share of the pie as opposed to just a flat rate per day, which could maybe sort of reduce the incentive to do a good job. So if you're working with somebody, you might be willing, you may want to be willing to give up some potential reward to get a better management out of your custom grazer. It may look bad on paper, but at the end of the year, you might be a lot happier if you had somebody with some skin in the game willing to work with you on that. So there's lots of different options, but you got to work through the numbers within your own operation, your own context, to make sure that it works for you. If you're basing it on $40 or $50 an acre pasture rent, in our position, trying to make it work on $200+ an acre tillable land rent, those numbers aren't going to work out the same. So do your numbers and make sure it works fairly for you. Great.
We did have one question come in. Person asking, do you have problems managing the 4-inch residual that we all want to keep in our pastures when you're custom grazing someone else's cattle? Maybe a way to reframe that is, what kind of contingency planning do you have in your agreements for when the growth isn't there and you have to choose between feeding the cattle and managing your pastures well?
That's a great thing to bring up, and I'll approach that first of all by saying that we actually don't graze that way in general anyway. 4 inches is rarely seen as far as residual on the land that we manage. It's often much, much more. And as a result, we've got a much bigger buffer before we ever get to that 4-inch residual. Now, I'm not saying that never happens anywhere, but the more you leave, typically, the more you have. So this idea with, anything wasted for trampled grass, that's where, just take a moment just to point out the fact that, like Jared said, when you're talking about advertised land, oftentimes we're looking at set stock grazing. There's a big difference between renting a pasture and throwing animals out there than there is to have managed grazing actively going on while the animals are there. And those are two very different worlds. And so before we were to ever get to risking the resource, in our case with custom grazing, we would depopulate if we needed to, or we would find more acres. And so that gets to be a really bad double-edged sword in a hurry, because a lot of people that think they can justify poor management this year because of the conditions will find that condition exacerbated in the future if we don't have better rains coming real quick. And so I'd urge people to really not take things down too far and deplete things even worse, because any more that you restrict that plant's ability to capture enough nutrients, to be able to harvest enough, be able to shelter that ground and armor it, is going to be a real difficult part to overcome in the future if these conditions persist.
Yeah, very good point.
Go ahead.
Anecdote
I was going to share based on that, the importance of ground cover. year earlier, we had it had been over a month since we got rain, and my dad and I we had a little shot of rain. We thought it was over, so we started going out. We had a 1/4 inch of rain, thought it was over, and then we went back out and it started raining again. It was complete downpour, had another 1/2 inch in a very short period of time. But since we were already soaked, we decided to go and kind of see what was actually happening. And so we went across the fence and to a neighbor's bean field. And one side of the fence is our pasture, had tall grass that had been laid flat, eaten about 50%, left the rest. And the neighbor's bean field that was exposed soil, both obviously hadn't had moisture in over a month and were very dry. One would think all of that moisture should soak up, in that soil. It's so dry, but there was water running down that bean field in between the rows of beans, just flowing off that field. And so we both ended up having the same, 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch of rain at that time, but all of ours soaked. When I went in ours, there was no moisture moving. The grass was, holding it puddled. And when we went out the next day, the neighbor's field also was just dry as a bone, and underneath the mat of hay, or the mat of pasture, was moisture and wet soil and mud. And so it was just kind of a unique anecdote to finally actually really get out and see it, not only after the fact, but while it was happening, what's actually happening. And we maybe got 3/4 of an inch of rain, and he maybe only captured 1/4 of an inch of rain. And so setting ourselves up to actually take advantage of the moisture that's coming when it comes is ever more important in times like this. And our management is going to be even more important.
Yeah. So holistic management calls effective rainfall, the rainfall that stays on your land and soaks in. Well, we have one more question, and then after that, we'll need to move on to another topic. But the question is, are there many contracts that use high density type grazing to maximize pasture productivity? Just in general, what do you see out there?
There should be more. There should be more.
It incentivizes the grazer, the landowner, the custom grazer more than anything. If you're doing a custom grazing business and charging on a per head per day basis, you literally have the ability to increase your stocking rate significantly by managing your grazing better. And so you're leaving money on the table if you are not managing well. That goes for a landowner or a custom grazer. As far as a livestock owner, I would say there's incentives to look for somebody managing that way too, because if you turn them out on pasture, as kind of Doug was saying, in the spring and leave them there all year, the diet, in the spring might be really great and all for that animal. At the end of summer, a lot of folks, at least in our region, I've seen have a mindset of summer is where they lose condition and they put it back on in the winter and with corn silage and feed. And that is not, summer is an opportunity to feed some pretty darn good feed when you manage well. So I would say there's incentives as both a livestock and a landowner and grazer side to seek out or manage grazing.
I absolutely agree with Jared on that. And I guess I just add that, if you're in the position where you're trying to get a contract arranged, or if you have resources you're looking at utilizing, reach out to people that have done it, or they have some knowledge, because if you look at it from the perspective of both parties can win and improve the resource and the cattle performance at the same time, then you've got a really good platform for some progress.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. And we will have some time at the end for more questions and answers. So if people have more questions for Jared and Doug, they'll still be around and we'll be able to catch up with them a little bit later. Now we wanted to turn to returning to the exchange, the Midwest Grazing Exchange, and just introduce to you the state coordinators across the region and have them just introduce themselves and maybe talk a little bit about your drought and forage availability in your state to help people understand how things are going across the region. I've seen that it's extremely variable, even within my state, even in my own county. So we've got a very strange year in terms of extremes this year. So why don't we start with, let's see, I'm going to start with my own state with Jacob. Jacob Grace, would you like to introduce yourself?
Great. Thanks, Laura. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. My name is Jacob Grace. I work with UW-Madison Center for Integrated Ag Systems and also with the Savannah Institute. And I'm the state host for Wisconsin for the Midwest Grazing Exchange. Drought conditions in the state right now are not as bad as in Minnesota or definitely farther west. We do have some moderate drought in southern parts of the state and kind of in the northwest corner. Other parts, as Laura mentioned, seem to be doing pretty well. So it's highly variable, but not too bad in most places. We currently have 6 listings for Wisconsin. Most of them are listing land as opposed to listing cattle. So some potential opportunities there. And we're working with some of our local and state grazing groups and grazing professionals to try to get the word out about the exchange.
All right, thank you, Jacob. Let's go to Cassidy in Illinois.
I apologize, Laura. I was interrupted on a phone call there for a minute, so I'm not exactly sure where we're at.
That's okay. We're just introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about how the exchange is working in your state and what the rainfall and drought and forage availability is in your state.
Okay. My name's Cassidy Blackwell, and I work with the Land Connection, which is based in East Central Illinois, but we support producers throughout the entire state. Our current situation, we are in the state of Illinois, we are fairly unaffected by the drought conditions currently, only in northern Illinois, so mostly northeastern Illinois. We've kind of had the opposite. We dealt with a lot of flooding around here that has been pretty damaging to a lot of those row crop fields, like Jared was talking about. You can walk around and see pretty massive holes in the soybean fields. But I do think as far as pasture goes, we are, as a state, we have limited pasture in general, but I do think the pasture is not, in terms of like growth of forage available, it should be pretty good right now. Unfortunately, we don't have a huge group of people using the grazing exchange yet. We think we only have about 4 postings, and I'm not exactly sure what the reasoning is there. I think we need to do more on the ground, like talking to people. And I'll be at the Heart of America Grazing Conference in Mount Vernon, Illinois next week. If anyone wants to stop by and talk about grazing or how we can make this work better for more folks, I'd be more than happy to talk to you.
That part of the state is where I think of Illinois as having some pretty significant grazing and livestock production. So
Yeah,
should
right. Yeah, and the
gather
more
some support
southern
there.
half.
Yeah, great. Okay, why don't we move on to Ashley? Ashley, are you still on? There you are.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ashley Conway. I'm coming to you all from Missouri, Columbia, Missouri today. I am a silvopasture researcher at the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry, and I'm also the Missouri State host for the Midwest Grazing Exchange. My feedback is going to be pretty similar to Cassidy. So right now, Missouri is one of the states in the Midwest that's really been primarily unaffected by the drought. And in fact, same as what she said, we've had excessive rainfalls in this spring and summer. It's been a pretty wet spring. So if anything, we have abundance of grass at this point if you're well positioned on your property. Missouri's only got about 4 people listed on our exchange right now, and ironically, only one of them is offering grass at the moment. So we are always looking for people who have land and grazing available. And forage production in Missouri and pasture Missouri is not a rare thing. So we definitely want to encourage folks to be posting their acreage if they offer custom grazing or if they just have some forage available. Now is definitely the time to be using it. And like Cassidy said, we're trying really hard to get the word out so that more people can use it and really make good use of this interstate connection for folks who really need some grass right now. And I think if my yard's any indication, we've got plenty of it. So that's sort of what I'm seeing here. And yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. How about Jared? Do you want to, you're the state coordinator for Minnesota. Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of a statewide perspective and what you're seeing?
Yeah, it's dry. We're pretty dry. There's some regions worse than others. In Southeast, we're fortunate to have had some moisture that a lot of the state hasn't. So we're sitting a little better off than a lot of places. I was looking at the map. We do have 4 land listings, but I know one of them is mine. We don't have extra grass. Another one I've talked to is, we posted them earlier on and have not been removed, so they probably should be, and I apologize for that. But I know that 3 of the 4 at least do not actually have listings, or do not actually have grass anymore. There's just a shortage of grass. I was going to mention one thing I forgot to mention earlier. I didn't see it on the list of other resources, but I think I do believe there's a Nebraska crop residue or corn stock grazing exchange as well. I don't know if that was listed or not, and if it's not, that might be something worth looking into as well.
Point. Thank you.
Don't have much to add for Minnesota.
All right. Cindy, you've also spoken a little bit about your South Dakota exchange. Do you want to talk a little bit about the drought situation in your state?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. South Dakota, primarily the whole state is in a drought. D3 is covering quite a bit of the area as well. And the D2 is primarily. So we have the whole area of the state is primarily opened up. I know Megan had touched on the CRP and emergency haying and grazing, and that has been pretty significant interest in South Dakota as far as the quality of feed and making sure the animal health is also important. So the nitrate testing and some of that has been something that we are encouraging people to make sure they are making sure the feed quality is very good too, and working with those producers. So we are wanting to also highlight, we have similar to some of the questions that are going on in the chat there with Ashley and Cassidy about the forages, not just the grasses, and having aftermath grazing and the cover crop grazing is very important, and the health of the ground, and bringing that ability to bring those livestock back onto some of that cropland. So we have kind of a unique situation. In 2019, we were one of the wettest times in South Dakota. We had record rainfall. So I think that has helped our situation, even though we are in drought conditions. We did have a lot of savings account of moisture down in the profile. So it did provide crops to look pretty well, actually. So if we can keep the interaction and keep the opportunity for the cattle or the sheep. That's one thing on the grazing exchange. You don't just have cattle, there are opportunities for other types of livestock to be able to be listed on both the Midwest Grazing Exchange and the South Dakota Grazing Exchange. So we just want to continue to get the word out, work with all the different partners. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the South Dakota Grazing Exchange, and if anyone has any information or questions about how we can uniquely tie these together, that was something Meg and I actually have had conversations about. So you can list on multiple sites, which is an opportunity for you to hopefully find the right connection that will make your either your livestock or your operation as healthy as it can be. So thank you again, Laura.
Thank you. And I'll wrap this up with Megan, if you have anything additional to talk about Iowa, and also if I've missed anyone who's a member of the exchange that's on today.
Yeah, Laura, I'll just reiterate that really the northern half of Iowa is in a moderate to severe drought, but we do see that southeast Iowa primarily has gotten plenty of rain. And so really what we're trying to do, our strategy is we have a pretty vast network of landowners through Practical Farmers of Iowa, but also through some other organizations like Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, which works with landowners that have easements that are most commonly in savanna and prairie. And so we are going to work with those organizations to promote this exchange to their demographic of landowners, which we think makes the most sense. And if we can target some specific counties in Southeast Iowa, even better. So that's the plan as of now.
Well, that kind of is a good lead into a question that I had, and then we'll open it up to questions from the whole group. And my question is, and Jane had a similar one, there are huge numbers of acres that are owned by people who don't farm them themselves. And I know, like in southern Iowa, there are a number of grasslands that are owned by people who use them for hunting primarily. How can the exchanges reach out to those non-farming landowners who might be interested in getting some land open for herds? And a corollary to that Jane asked was, if we listed a bunch of herds on the site, would there be landowners in some of these other states that would see it as an opportunity to partner?
This is a great question, Laura. And I know that, one thing that we could do. So, PFI does have non-operating landowners within our network and within our membership. So that's kind of an easy way for us to populate a list of those and get the word out. We're putting on a landowner workshop series and plugging the Midwest Grazing Exchange next week. It starts. So we've thought about that, but what about the non-operating landowners that we don't have a direct connection to? And so could we work with groups like Pheasants Forever, or, like I said, Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, that might have more of a direct connection to some of those non-operating landowners? Maybe even watershed coordinators in specific counties. To get some of this promotional material out around the Midwest Grazing Exchange. Those are a few ideas that came up.
Yeah, good ideas. Any of the other coordinators have some thoughts on that?
We've done some similar things in South Dakota. We have had outreach, just like Megan did with PFI, as well as, sending the direct mailings to them, providing that information at the USDA and FSA offices. For the grazing exchange, we provided our resources there that they would be able to give to the landowners, and having that ability, because quite a few of them, as you know, if they're not operating, they still have a contract if they have CRP that they have to fulfill for that midterm management possibly. So that was an opportunity for them, and I liked Megan's idea with the Pheasants Forever. We have worked with them directly. We have quite a few pheasant lodges and some different things, and they see the benefit as well, is having those cattle or the livestock out there. So it is an opportunity to have good conversations with people.
Yeah, when I was working on the Grazing Broker project, we were amazed at the number of non-operating landowners who just didn't know that there were other options other than renting for annual row crops. And if you talk to them about the soil building benefits of managed grazing and help them overcome the hurdles of thinking about fencing and watering, they're very enthusiastic. So that's not a short-term solution, but maybe a longer-term one. Any other comments from our state coordinators or suggestions from anyone on what groups can help us publicize this and help out people who are in need of feed this year?
I was just going to jump in to say first, thank you, Megan and Cindy, for those great ideas. Definitely going to do a bunch of that stuff. Probably should have been doing it, so sorry. But I do think I got a text actually during this about this question from a producer we work with, he said, he would be happy to have cattle come onto his land. He just needs more of this information about what that would mean and how that interaction works with having people come graze the stubble or the cover crops. So I'm thinking about definitely working closer with our soil and water conservation districts to get this information out, and the trusted advisor that a lot of our row crop farmers work with. I think that's going to be probably a pretty good conduit. And I know, work folks with Pheasants Forever doing, especially a lot of the women caring for the land events. I feel like this would be pretty successful at as well.
Super.
One additional thing I just wanted to point out that we've tried to do in South Dakota, a lot of our beginning farmers and ranchers may not be able to purchase land because of their financial ability. And this grazing exchange has provided them an opportunity so they can purchase a few cows, but they may need the land in order for them to do that. So we have worked with different lenders and having that information out there for them. So it's a great opportunity for beginning farmers and ranchers to start building some assets and making those connections with either non-operating landowners or even some neighbors. Some people are not fortunate to have the ability to come back to an operation. So this is one way they can build some assets and hopefully grow their herd and be able to purchase land down the road. So that is another aspect that we try to promote through the grazing exchanges.
Yeah, and that's another benefit that a non-operating landowner in particular might really value, helping a beginning farmer get started.
Yeah, Laura, I
Okay,
just
any
have
other?
one more.
Oh,
just
go
one more
ahead. Yeah.
comment. We're thinking of residues, we're thinking of cover crops, and we're thinking of grasslands, but we also have to consider that there's some cropland fields that aren't going to justify having a harvester run over them. And in those cases, Cindy was good about pointing out the fact that we need to do some nitrate testing specifically, on some of those crops before we go out there and graze them. But let's not, eliminate some of those opportunities as well, because if we can get some of that remaining crop, whatever might be out there, in touch with the ground and inoculate it with some of the entrails of some livestock, we can really move things forward in those fields as well.
Very good point. Yeah. So we've got quite a few minutes left for more questions, and I can start us off with a question that I had for Doug and Jared and anyone else who wants to respond. But especially when you're talking about non-operating landowners and grazing cover crops or crop residue, you end up potentially having a three-way relationship to balance. And I was just wondering if you guys had dealt with that and if you had any thoughts about that.
So when we send our cows down to Nebraska, the person we're running them on actually is running the cows on a lot of ground that is not owned by him or even operated by him. It's just crop farmers, and in that region, a lot of crop farmers want the residue removed with livestock. It's seen as an asset to the farmer, and so they're happy to let livestock come on, but they don't want to do it themselves. And so their opportunity for an entrepreneurial young man or woman or something to get into agriculture is to just potentially go out and find crop farmers who are okay with the livestock but don't want to do the work themselves. But we don't have any connection or relationship with the landowner or operator. It's entirely the grazer's responsibility. We're hiring him as part of his fee as a contract grazer, is to manage that relationship with the landowner, manage our cattle, make sure they have food, water, fence, and salt mineral.
Yeah, that's really good. You brought up a great point, even with absentee landowners, because, some really important questions should be asked, in my opinion. And, a lot of times the absentee landowners are hanging on to land. There's, it's a family farm. It's been in the family for how long, but they don't actively farm it. But just asking the question, what kind of legacy they want to leave. And, there are ways that we can really affect very positively with livestock integration with a third party like Jared had talked about, that's willing to manage the livestock on some of these lands. And so those types of relationships can really be beneficial over time, but they do take an investment. And so conversations sometimes need to start earlier than later, not necessarily when we need to do something right now in the conditions we have where we have drought, but again, having those conversations and explaining and educating as much as people are willing to hear, educating the benefits of this whole process and how good management is so critical to make anything work well.
Great, thank you. So far, I'm not seeing any more questions.
Laura, I want to bring up a
Yeah,
question that
go
was
ahead.
asked to me directly earlier.
Sure.
about, are we, like, as administrators on the Grazing Exchange, are we able to monitor connections that are made through the site? And so I just want to address that with everyone. We specifically set the site up so we cannot monitor connections. So this is solely a matchmaking service. We provide the platform to make the match, but like, because of privacy policies, we're not trying to follow that match through to monitor the connection. So I just wanted to make that clear. But the thing is, we would like to be able to report on successes and, learn from each other. So one thing we've included on our landing page is an area to voluntarily enter a success story if you'd like to tell it. So that would be the only way if a farmer felt as though, or a landowner felt as though they'd wanted to enter a success story so we could elevate it and publicize it. That would be the only way we could actually monitor a connection.
Okay.
One thing I would just mention, from if there's crop farmers out there who have never considered grazing cattle on your land, this would be a great year to consider it. And it really doesn't have to be a lot of work. The farmer we found didn't actually, in the local farmer in Minnesota here, he didn't have to do a thing. We went out, built the fence in a day, took it down in the day in the spring. In that situation in particular, he had water that we had access to all winter, running water on that farm, so we didn't have to deal with water. We managed the livestock, and we got about 50 cents per day, or we paid 50 cents per day per head, and he got 60 cow days per acre, so $30 per acre in additional revenue, and that's a real number that should be considered as an additional profit center possibility. And so, this can be a genuine enterprise, not just helping a neighbor who's struggling with drought, but it could be looked at as a real profit center in your farm. So, did
you have to do some convincing on bringing livestock onto their land? I know here in Wisconsin and other areas, and especially like in Illinois, where there's not a livestock culture, there may be some real hesitation among crop farmers about bringing livestock, and compaction and all those arguments against it that we hear about.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've worked with two farmers, and one of them has a view that I'm not necessarily so fond of necessarily. He sees crop residue as bad. Like, he's like, I want to get rid of all my residue. It's going to hurt everything. And so he always sold all the corn stalks off, but we convinced him rather than sell the corn stalks to let us graze them. So for him, in his mindset, it was an asset that he could generate and still keep the fertility. The other person sought us out. He wanted to integrate livestock into his cropping enterprise, and so might be fun going out and talking to a no-till cover cropper. Is the situation ours is. He's a larger scale no-till cover cropper who wanted to add that livestock integration principle and didn't want to add the livestock himself. And so, yeah,
it's all the good education work SFA has been doing over the years.
yeah, that's right.
So Jane, do we have any other questions popping up?
I don't see any other questions. Nope. So last call for questions, I guess, but all our presenters were amazing and answered everything.
Yeah. Everybody did a great job. Thank you all.
This has been recorded, and I'll get the recording up on the Midwest Perennial Forage Working Group website once it drops, and I can get it into a YouTube format.
If there's any more questions, people can reach out directly to me, and I would imagine Doug from SFA. That's our job. Can't speak for him specifically, but
Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us, and Jane will be back out to all of us with some links to where you can find the recording and other resources from the Midwest Perennial Forage website and the PFI website and the Pasture Project and all of the partners who are involved. Thanks for joining.
Thanks all.